This is Science Lesson 2 for this week. It is on pollination. You should already have completed the lesson on the male and female parts of the flower. Please put today's date and the title in your book. You will need to pause this video in order to complete tasks, and any questions, please go to the Teams meeting that will be available on your timetabled time. Okay, so first thing to think about is what causes hay fever. So last lesson we looked at the male and female parts of the flower, and we looked at some of the bits that are produced by those parts in order for them to reproduce. So do you know which part causes hay fever? Maybe you have hay fever yourself. What is it that gets onto you that causes you to have that reaction? So it's an allergic reaction to pollen, and it's usually when it comes into contact with your mouth, nose, eyes or throat, and it can cause irritation to those parts of your body. And that pollen is a fine powder that's produced by plants, and it's crucial for plants to be able to reproduce. So we're going to have a look at how plants use this pollen in order to reproduce. Recap from last lesson then. So A to D in your book quickly. Can you look at these parts and name them? So we've got A, this outer part, usually colourful to attract insects. What did we call that? B is made up of the anther and the filament. So what do we call that male part of the plant made up of those two bits? C is this bit here. So what is this base bit of the plant called? So we've got inside the ovary, we've got which cell that we need for reproduction. And then D, what are these two lower parts called that protect the flower bud? So A to D, can you remember those? And then extension question, what is the function of this stigma at the top of this female part? Pause the video now to answer those. Check your answer then. So we had A is the petal. So the petal are the coloured parts that attract the insects. The anther and filament are the male part, which are called the stamen. The ovule are the cells produced in the ovary, which are the female cells for reproduction. And the sepal is the bit that protects the flower bud as it's opening. The extension then is that the stigma is sticky so that it catches pollen grains, and those pollen grains need to land on that stigma if we're going to get the reproduction to occur. So how are new plants made? Okay, so just like people, the formation of a new plant begins with fertilisation. So fertilisation occurs when a male and female sex cell meet and their nucleus joins. So the pollen grain, which is the male sex cell in a flower, needs to fertilise the ovule, which is the female sex cell in a flower. For this to happen, the pollen from the anther needs to transfer to the stigma. And when that happens, it is called pollination, and it can happen either by insects or by the wind. So we've got two types of pollination that can occur. We can get pollination between two different plants, and when that happens, we get cross-pollination, so the crossing over of pollen from one plant to another plant. Or we can get pollination between the male and female parts of the same plant, and that's called self-pollination. So when the pollen from that one plant is moved onto the stigma of that same plant, it is pollinating itself, so self-pollination. The next part of this video is going to be a little video clip from Bite Size. You need to use that video clip to summarise the information on how pollination occurs and what needs to happen in pollination. So pause the video now in order to write these sentence starters down. Once you've written the sentence starters, Continue playing the video and see if you can complete them to summarise pollination and how it occurs and the two types of pollination.
All living things are called organisms, and they all have one thing in common: they die. So they have to produce offspring to carry on the species. It's passing life on to the next generation. And they do this by a process called reproduction. Now, one way of reproducing is sexually, and this involves the joining of two special cells, one male and one female. And that's how most animals reproduce. In the case of humans, men have small cells called sperm, and women much larger cells called eggs. These two cells need to get together so the nuclei can fuse. It's called fertilization. When they do, a new life starts to grow. Animals are not the only sexual reproducers. Most types of plants do the same. But whereas most animals are either male or female, plants have both a male and a female part. But where do we find them? In here. Now this is the male part, or stamen, and it produces the male sex cell, pollen. And the pollen is made in here, in the anther, on the top of this filament. And this is the female part, or carpel. And it produces the female sex cell, or egg, in the ovary. Now, in flowering plants, sexual reproduction takes place in two stages. The male pollen has to reach the female stigma. And this first part of the process is called pollination. Now, plants can pollinate themselves, and this is called self-pollination, but most of the time they don't. Mostly, the pollen travels from one plant to another and pollinates that, and this is called cross-pollination. But how does the pollen get from one flower to another? If the wind blows and the pollen is light enough, well, then the wind carries the pollen to the other plants. But more often, this is not the method used. Most plants pollinate by special delivery.
Now you've watched the video clip, you should be ready to check that you have included all of the main points and finished these sentences. So once you've completed them, check you understand the following. So the formation of new plants starts with fertilisation. So we need to get the pollen grain, which is the male sex cell from the plant, to fertilise the female ovule. Pollen from the anther, to do this, needs to transfer to the stigma. This process is called pollination, when that pollen from the anther transfers to the stigma, and it can occur by either wind or by insects. Pollination between two different plants is called cross-pollination. Self-pollination happens between the male and female parts of the same plant. The difference between insect and wind pollination then. So flowering plants need to get pollen from one flower to another, either within the plant for self-pollination, so between the anther and stigma in the same plant, or between plants of the same species for cross-pollination. So that's where the pollen from one flower is transferred to the stigma of a different flower within the same species. However, pollen can't move on its own, so animals or the wind have to move the pollen for plants. So plants will either move that pollen using insects or other animals. That would be the example here shown in A. So A would be an example of a flower that uses insects or animals to transport its pollen, or by the wind, and B is an example of a plant that uses the wind. So the features that these two plants have are special for whether they need insects or whether they need wind. And what we're going to do now is have a look at the differences in those flowers. So what you need to do is copy out this table and complete it using the PowerPoint, which is in the Files section of Teams. So some of them have been completed for you. if you open that PowerPoint, you will see that there are a series of information cards. Read through the information on those cards, pick out the important bits about these parts of the two types of plant. So what are the petals like for insect pollinated plants? What's the nectar like in insect pollinated plants? And then what are the scent, pollen and any other features of wind pollinated plants using the information from those cards. To finish off then, have a go at answering these 3 questions. So they start off a little bit easier and then get harder, the last one being a 6-mark one. QWC, looking for the quality of your written communication. So can you answer that question in full sentences? So the first one, pollination can occur in a number of ways. Describe what pollination is. Number 2, describe the difference between cross-pollination and self-pollination. And then finally, our longest answer question, which is the most challenging there, explain in detail the difference between an insect-pollinated plant and a wind-pollinated plant. So that is summarising the information you've completed in your table. So pause the video now and complete these questions before checking your answers. Okay, so here are the 3 answers we were looking for. So number 1, it's the transfer of pollen from an anther to a stigma. Number 2, cross-pollination is when the pollen from an anther of one flower is transferred to the stigma of another flower, whereas self-pollination is when pollen is transferred to the stigma of the same flower. And then looking at number 3, the longest 6-mark one, these have been summarised in a table. So we're looking for any 3 from the insect side and any 3 from the wind pollinated side. So things like the insect pollinated flowers are going to have large colourful petals to attract those insects. They're often going to smell very nice to attract those insects, and they often contain nectar so that the insect that lands there is getting something out of being at that plant and then has a purpose for moving on to another plant and transferring that pollen with it. Wind pollinated, on the other hand, doesn't have any need for brightly coloured petals, so these are often brown or dull in colour. They're small, there's no scent because they're not trying to attract insects in, and there's no nectar. There's usually lots and lots of pollen produced by these wind pollinated plants because that pollen wants to be blown away and hopefully blown onto the stigma of another flower to pollinate it. So read through those, check your answers, and any questions, please go to the Teams call during the scheduled lesson to ask them.